Caracas, Venezuela, 2:01 in the morning, January 3rd, 2026. The city is dark, the streets are quiet, and somewhere inside a heavily fortified compound in the Venezuelan capital, the president of a sovereign nation is asleep. Then the helicopters come. Flying at 100 feet above the water, silent, fast, invisible to radar, they carry Delta Force operators, CIA intelligence officers, and Department of Justice law enforcement agents. 150 aircraft are already in the sky, launched from 20 different bases spread across the Western Hemisphere. F-35 fighter jets, remotely piloted drones, naval vessels offshore. This was not a skirmish. This was not a warning shot. This was the most complex, most audacious American military raid since the night Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan in 2011. And by sunrise, the sitting president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, would be in handcuffs, on American soil, facing a federal judge in New York City. The question the whole world woke up asking that morning was not just how this happened. The question was, why did the most powerful military on Earth fly halfway across the hemisphere to kidnap a president? And who, exactly, benefits from the answer? But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to Hugo Chavez, the firebrand Venezuelan president, who in 2007 made a decision that sent shockwaves through American boardrooms. That year, Venezuela nationalized billions of dollars of oil assets belonging to ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and Chevron. American energy giants, companies that had spent decades building Venezuela's oil infrastructure, were told to leave. Their assets, their platforms, their investments, seized. The legal battles that followed dragged on for years. ConocoPhillips eventually won an international arbitration award. Exxon secured partial compensation, but the wounds never fully healed. When Maduro succeeded Chavez in 2013, he inherited not only the socialist project, but the hostility of Washington. And under his rule, Venezuela's oil production, once peaking at 3.5 million barrels per day, collapsed to barely 800,000 barrels per day. The country with the world's largest proven oil reserves was producing less than Saudi Arabia produces in a single afternoon. By 2025, Venezuela was broke, isolated, and fractured. Maduro had survived coup attempts, crippling U.S. sanctions and mass protests. But he had also, according to a U.S. federal indictment unsealed that same year, allegedly turned the Venezuelan state into a narco-trafficking enterprise, using the Tren de Aragua gang and other criminal networks to flood the United States with fentanyl and cocaine. Washington had had enough. In August 2025, President Donald Trump signed a secret directive. It authorized the Pentagon to use military force against Latin American drug cartels. He also doubled the U.S. government's bounty on Nicolás Maduro to $50 million. Shortly after, a naval fleet carrying over 4,500 sailors and Marines began moving toward Venezuelan waters. The operation had a name, Operation Southern Spear. On September 2nd, 2025, American forces fired the opening shot, striking a vessel in international waters that U.S. officials claimed was carrying Tren de Aragua operatives and cocaine bound for the United States. 11 people died in that strike. Then came a second strike, a third, then a fourth. Before January, the United States had carried out more than 20 lethal strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats in Caribbean waters. At least 115 people were killed, according to announcements from the Pentagon itself. The United Nations pushed back hard. Human rights experts warned that international law does not allow governments to kill alleged drug traffickers without due process. They called the strikes extrajudicial killings. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, called one strike outright murder. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, condemned the operations. Brazil filed diplomatic protests. Maduro himself, in an interview broadcast on Venezuelan state television on New Year's Day 2026, said his country was open to negotiating an anti-drug agreement with Washington. He insisted Venezuela was not a cocaine producer. He was still talking, but by that point, Trump had already made his decision. Trump approved the strike before Christmas. The military had spent months building a scale model of Maduro's compound, and rehearsing the raid inside it. A CIA team had already crept into Venezuela, tracking Maduro's movements, his patterns, his sleep schedule, where he slept, what he ate, where he traveled. 1 week before the operation, Trump called Maduro directly. "You've got to surrender," Trump told him. Maduro did not surrender. At a New Year's Eve party at Mar-a-Lago, dressed in a tuxedo, Trump was asked by reporters what his resolution was for 2026. He smiled and said nothing. 3 days later, in the darkest hours of January 3rd, Operation Absolute Resolve began. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described it this way: 150 aircraft launched from 20 bases on land and sea. Helicopters crossed into Venezuelan airspace at 100 feet above the water, low enough to avoid radar. The operation had been planned for months. It was rehearsed in precise detail. Nothing was left to chance. On arrival, the extraction force came under fire. They returned fire with, in Kane's words, overwhelming force and self-defense. 1 American aircraft was hit, but remained airborne. Every single U.S. aircraft came home. Inside the compound, Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, gave up. At 2:01 in the morning, they were taken into American custody. By that evening, Maduro and Flores had landed in New York City, charged with narco-terrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, and illegal weapons possession. Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago and called it one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might in history. He said the United States would now run Venezuela until a proper transition of power could take place. The world had never seen anything quite like this. The reaction was immediate, and it split the world almost perfectly in two. In Latin America, right-wing governments broadly supported the action. Left-wing governments erupted in fury. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva wrote that the bombings on Venezuelan territory and the capture of its president crossed an unacceptable line. He called it a flagrant violation of international law and a grave affront to Venezuelan sovereignty. China expressed shock and condemned the use of force. Russia's government was already on record condemning American strikes in the region since September. Ben Saul, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, called the operation illegal aggression and the abduction of the president an illegal act. In Venezuela itself, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president. A national state of emergency was declared. Security forces flooded the streets of Caracas. But in Washington, the story moved on fast, because within hours of the capture, before the international condemnations had even finished rolling in, something else happened. He said, "We are going to have our very large United States oil companies go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country." And those words were not accidental. Here is what the press conferences did not lead with. Here is what the ticker tape coverage of a dramatic military raid almost buried. Venezuela sits on an estimated 303 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves. That is roughly 17% of the world's total proven supply. It is more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Kuwait. It is, by every credible measure, the single largest oil endowment on the planet. And for years, U.S. energy companies have been locked out of it. In 2007, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips had their Venezuelan assets seized by Chavez's government. Exxon and ConocoPhillips pursued international arbitration for years, eventually winning partial compensation, but never recovering their full position in the country. Chevron was the only U.S. major still operating in Venezuela by the time Maduro fell, and it was operating under a restricted U.S. government license. On the morning after the raid, shares of Chevron rose 5%, ConocoPhillips rose 5%, ExxonMobil rose 2%. Oilfield services giants Halliburton and SLB each jumped 8%. Markets do not lie. They do not editorialize. They simply price information. And the information they were pricing on January 5th, 2026 was the following. The largest proven oil reserve on Earth had just been unlocked for American energy companies. Not through a trade deal, not through a decade of diplomacy, but through an overnight military operation. The Congressional Research Service noted this directly. Legal analysts raised the question of whether drug trafficking charges, however serious, provided a sufficient legal basis under international law to justify the forcible abduction of a sitting head of state from his own country. It is important to note The drug trafficking charges against Maduro were real. They were filed in a U.S. federal court. Maduro pleaded not guilty. The legal process is ongoing. None of that is disputed. But it is also documented fact that within hours of his capture, Trump was publicly promising that American oil companies would rebuild Venezuela's energy sector. It is documented fact that oil stocks surged. It is documented fact that Trump himself boasted that Venezuela's oil reserves, the world's largest, were now effectively within America's reach. This was not coincidence. The timing was not an accident. Layer 1 of this story, the U.S. military captured a foreign leader accused of drug trafficking. Layer 2, this was the culmination of a decade-long strategic pressure campaign against a government that had seized American oil assets and aligned itself with Russia, Cuba, and China. Layer 3, the hidden beneficiaries were identified publicly. Within 24 hours, 3 of the largest oil companies on Earth, whose share prices told the real story before any press release ever could. So what happens now? Venezuela's oil production, under Maduro, had declined from a peak of 3.5 million barrels per day to barely 800,000. Analysts say that even with an orderly transition of power and full American investment, rebuilding Venezuela's infrastructure will take years. The reserves are there, but the pipelines, refineries, and technical expertise have deteriorated after a decade of neglect and sanctions. The precedent set by Operation Absolute Resolve is arguably its most dangerous legacy. For the first time since the United States invasion of Panama in 1989, which similarly resulted in the capture of Manuel Noriega on drug trafficking charges, a sitting head of state has been forcibly removed from his country by American military force. The 1989 Panama operation is instructive. Noriega was convicted, Panama stabilized, slowly, but the U.S. occupation lasted years, and the geopolitical damage to Washington's image in Latin America lingered for decades. Today, Venezuela faces a similar crossroads. What comes after Maduro is uncertain. The CFR and independent analysts warn that without a credible and inclusive transition, Venezuela risks fracturing, which would make even basic oil production impossible, let alone the billion-dollar investment Trump is promising. And for the United Kingdom, the stakes are direct. British energy firms operate in the same regional waters. British shipping lanes run through the Caribbean. Any prolonged instability in Venezuela, or any precedent that sovereign immunity no longer protects heads of state from foreign military abduction, has implications that extend far beyond South America. This is not just a story about one man in handcuffs in a New York courtroom. This is a story about what the most powerful military in the world is willing to do, and what it is willing to call justice, when the prize is 303 billion barrels of oil. So here is the verdict. The United States carried out a technically extraordinary military operation. By every tactical measure, Operation Absolute Resolve was precise, controlled, and successful. No American lives were lost. The target was captured. The objective was achieved. The legal and moral questions are harder. A sitting president was removed by foreign military force. International law experts, the United Nations, and dozens of governments have called this a violation of sovereignty. Whether the drug trafficking charges justify this action under international law, not just American law, remains a genuinely open and unresolved question, and the timing of the oil company announcements, the stock market reaction, and Trump's own words about Venezuela's energy future make it impossible to separate the military action from the economic interest it serves. The winners so far, U.S. oil majors and their shareholders, the geopolitical architects in Washington who spent years engineering this moment. The losers, so far, Maduro in a New York courtroom, international legal norms already under pressure before this, and potentially Venezuela itself, whose people, whatever they thought of their president, now watch a foreign power decide what comes next. Was this justice? Was this intervention? Or was this the oldest story in the book, where military might and economic interest wear each other's clothes until you can no longer tell them apart? Let us know in the comments what you think. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.